get this started, we had some members of the new Plymouth Guard, you know, militia guys, sometimes they're just wandering around, you know, looking to do drills, and they just happened on the Alden House today. You know, they're here just as part of a special visit, and because they are carrying a perfect reproduction of one of the Alden artifacts that is on display at Pilgrim Hall, which you probably know, we thought, what a great way to introduce Donna with the new Plymouth Guard.
I was actually dared to get this into the tent. My name is Joe Pereira. I'm a sergeant with New Plymouth Guard. We've probably met a good deal of you before, and keep this short because it's 1,000 degrees and you'd much rather listen to Donna than me. It is true that there is an original halberd. It's this weapon that I hold that was found here in the 1960 excavation of the old Alden House. And although it's not known if John Alden carried it, used it, etc., but why else would it have ended up in his basement? I don't think somebody ran by with a stolen halberd and just threw it in there. So that halberd is in, as you know, Pilgrim Hall Museum under Donna's care. And one of our members several years ago became fascinated with the halberd and thought how wonderful if there could be a reproduction done that could reside here at the Alden House. And he went about asking Donna's permission to take measurements to get into the case, photographs, etc., so that we had a basis to work from. And then went about finding a bladesmith who was willing to take on the challenge. So Stan Waldman is the gentleman from our group that had 2 of these done, one for himself and one for the museum. So the dimensions, the shape, the decoration, etc., is virtually identical to the original. This is probably a bit heavier than the original. The original was done out of iron, and this is steel that could be sharpened and make much more fierce. You probably wonder, you know, what good was a weapon like this in 1620? It was the sign of typically a sergeant that would carry one of these and put it right through the roof, so that he could be identified first as a sergeant, but could be more readily found on the field of battle. So officers would have carried a single-bladed weapon and sergeants one of these. If they were made of a stout enough metal, which they had been in earlier days, and by the beginning of the 17th century, they were being made of lighter metals and more ceremonial. They were a fearsome weapon, especially when you're dealing with pikes and other pole weapons. You have a broad blade, a bill, and a spike, all of which could be used for many terrible things. I have to thank Stan for doing this. He took something that's in a case and should be protected, reproduced it so that people can see it up close, so people can touch it, heft it, understand it. So that's it. If I have any other questions about a halberd, I'm more than happy to help you. But more importantly, it is a deep pleasure to introduce someone who I've worked with a handful of times over at Pilgrim Hall in our functions as New Plymouth Guard. She has always been a tremendous hostess there. She is doing an incredible job with that museum. And it just, as an historian, it just does my heart good to see what's happening. So without any further ado, my pleasure to introduce the executive director of Pilgrim Hall, Donna Curtin. I'll get this out of the way.
The sword at one end and the halberd at the other. Well, that was a splendid introduction, I must say. I'm now a member of the Kindred with my paperwork in order. I have been introduced at the point of a halberd, which not that many people can say. And I hope we're going to make it through this rather hot day under the tent and learn a little bit about 200 years of Pilgrim Hall Museum. And I think I might keep this rolling right along. Hopefully the breeze will keep us revived and refreshed. So as Desiree said, I don't know, have we got I can't see this at all. There we go. The reflection is complete. I won't be able to see it, but that's all right. Pilgrim Hall, if you could just move to the next slide, is the flagship of an earlier organization called the Pilgrim Society, which incorporated in 1820. And we actually observed the Society's anniversary back in 2020. Beginning in January, we had a little beer party, and then we were planning all these things, as you may sound familiar to you, but all that we could manage for the 200th anniversary of the Pilgrim Society later that year was a socially distanced cupcake party. It was very lovely and fun and rather exciting under those circumstances. But as I'm talking a little bit about the history of Pilgrim Hall, I want you to realize that institutionally, today, we think of the Society and the museum as one. But when we're looking back at history, of course, there's a little bit of a distinct path and chronology for each one. So sometimes they might be seen as a little separate, and sometimes I use the one hat, the Pilgrim Society and Pilgrim Hall Museum, all as one. Next slide, please. There are many ways to acknowledge, I think the next one. Yeah, there are many ways to acknowledge the museum's 2 centuries of a very vibrant existence. And I'm going to talk briefly about these categories through this talk. There are the people who had the vision to create the museum. Those who believed that the story of the Mayflower Pilgrims was nationally significant, a story of America's beginnings, and worthy of preservation and remembrance. But we can also look at Pilgrim Hall Museum as a repository of artifacts and artworks, items such as the Alden halberd, that tell the story of Plymouth Colony's beginnings and our region's development over time. We can also look at the historic building itself. It has a fascinating story, the story of its creation, its evolution over time. And we can also look at Pilgrim Hall Museum's role in the community, its historical role, its rather profound influence in shaping the Plymouth that many of you know today. It would not be the same, was it not, for the Pilgrim Society and Pilgrim Hall Museum, as we're going to see a little bit. Next slide, please. Now, we're working on a book version, a timeline history of Pilgrim Hall Museum that hopefully is going to come out by the end of our 200th anniversary year. And we're going to take a quick look at the time frame of the museum, and I've added in a little dash of Aldens, because there's a little intersection there as well. It really is important in understanding Pilgrim Hall to realize that creating a museum was part of the vision of the Pilgrim Society right from the get-go. Next slide, please. Now, I hope you might be able to see this. One of the earliest Pilgrim Society documents that we have in the museum archives is a printed advertisement from 1818 entitled simply Pilgrims. And it's a call for subscribers, for people to make a financial commitment towards the creation of, quote, an association of citizens of good moral character to be denominated the Pilgrim Society, the specific objects of which are to establish the annual celebration of the 22nd December upon a permanent foundation, to erect an edifice in the town of Plymouth, provided with halls and other apartments suitable to the festive occasion, and a depository for such appropriate portraitures and antiquities as can be procured. So in addition to observing the anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims every year, the goal of creating a repository and a collection is really the genesis of Pilgrim Hall Museum. And it began in 1818. On a separate page and continued on the back of this Pilgrim flyer, and I kind of love this. We're all doing fundraising right now. We might want to steal the subscription idea here. But on the back is the list of those people who actually signed up and put their name to the page and said, yes, I am going to invest. I'm going to make a commitment. There are 3 columns: the names of the subscriber, the town from whence they claimed the residence at the time and the amount that they were willing to give. It ranged from $5 all the way up to $100, which in 1818 was a big chunk of change. Maybe not quite so significant as the wonderful gift I hear was awarded to the Alden Kindred today. And congratulations for that. That's wonderful news. We all applaud that. Yeah. But $100 in 1818 was significant. Next slide, please. Now, in November of 1819, the members of this interested group held a public meeting to discuss the formation of this proposed society and its intention to commemorate the landing of the fathers in the town of Plymouth every year. And by January of 1820, they had garnered enough interest that they felt they could take the plunge, and they officially incorporated the organization in January 1820, the 200th anniversary of Pilgrim's founding. Next slide, please. So who were some of the people who were involved in this process? Who were the people who made it happen? Yeah, you got it. Pauline has got the eyes there. It is a group that collectively we haven't studied very deeply, but they do deserve deeper investigation. There were 26 individual original subscribers, and these were mostly well-to-do men, although women attended events and they volunteered right from the beginning of the society's history. The organization was founded and coordinated entirely by men. And the first individuals to commit to this project came from 8 different towns, from all the way from Boston, New Bedford, and Cape Cod, though with the majority from Plymouth, the Plymouth County area, most from Plymouth and here in the South Shore, including Duxbury. And these guys were bankers, they were merchants, sea captains, attorneys, traders, farmers, and many of them shared connections between each other and among themselves through family ties, through local lineage, business networks. And for many of them, importantly, there was a shared generational experience. Nearly all had lived through the upheaval of the Revolution during their lives. Many had actually served in the war, and this may have given them a special sense of having lived through history and understanding its importance and their desire to preserve it going forward. Next slide, please. So, oh, sorry, that's the list of everybody from the towns. You can see, you might see some familiar names on there. And the next slide, please. Okay. So I was surprised to learn that one of the earliest subscribers to Pilgrim Hall Museum, and we have his beautiful signature on that document, was Major Judah Alden, the great-great-grandson of John and Priscilla, and raised here in Duxbury in the Alden family home. Hold on to your tablecloths there, because it's coming up here. And a participant like others of this group in the American Revolution. He served in Duxbury's Revolutionary Company of Minutemen and then became an officer in the Continental Army and served through the course of the war, as you all know. But he signed his name to this appeal and pledged, what do you guess? Between 5 and 100. Oh, I'm sorry, it was 5. All right. He had things to do in Duxbury as well, I think. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Okay. Now, among the original, not the subscribers, but there were also those who went and signed their name to the Articles of Incorporation that were filed with the Commonwealth back in January of 1820. And these folks, these might be names that some of you know: John Watson, Joshua Thomas, Beza Hayward, William Davis, Barnabas Hedge, all very prominent local figures. And I'm going to just tell you briefly, sort of on the other side of the scale, about John Watson. And I don't know if you're familiar with John Watson, but he was one of Plymouth's wealthy merchants. He was a founder of the Old Colony Club, which had been established in 1769, a gentleman's club. And their membership overlapped considerably with that of the early Pilgrim Society. And both groups shared this deep interest in Pilgrim history in the founding of the Old Colony. Watson himself was a trader and merchant. He was very involved in the sea cow fishery. Interesting, that's trading in the tusks of the sea cow and their oil. And he had a wide range of business ventures. We have some of the Watson family's account books in our archives, and they're like this thick. They're beautifully bound in vellum, just crammed full of details and information that we're hoping to be able to bring more to light. But when political sympathies divided during the Revolution, Watson, unlike Major Judah, retained some hesitation about making this revolutionary leap and had sympathies for the Loyalist cause. He even signed a protest in 1773 against the town's Tea Party resolutions, and that didn't go over well in Plymouth. He later took an oath of allegiance to the American cause, but even so, some of the townspeople were a little suspicious, and he was called before Plymouth's Committee of Correspondence, Inspection, and Safety, having been reported as harboring ideas inimical to the United States, and for actually saying, although it was hearsay, that if he had to drink to the success of the British arms, or if he had to drink to the success of either army, it would be success to the British arms. So he was in a bit of dicey water there, but he convinced a special town meeting to hear his case that he should not be tried and booted out of town. And when the committee reported him again, Plimmoth took no action against John Watson. So he ends up paying for a Continental soldier to serve in his stead. And after the war, he moves out to the island in the harbor, which he owned, Clark's Island. And he's safely ensconced from the criticisms of those who had disagreed with him during the Revolution. In his later years, he becomes involved with the Pilgrim Society, and he's working closely with men who had served as soldiers and officers in the American Army. And they came together to achieve this vision of preserving this important history. And although he dies, I believe in 1826, he did live long enough to see Pilgrim Hall Museum opened. Next slide. Now we have in rolling right along, this organization, you know, articles of incorporation in January. By May, they are choosing their officers and trustees. The Honorable Joshua Thomas is elected the first president of the society. Next slide, please. And among the early trustees, we have John Watson, we just spoke about. Others, William Davis, Sabdiel Sampson, Thomas Jackson, James Seaver of Kingston was involved. Others, including a member from Boston named Alden Bradford. Next slide, please. Oh, no, I think I'd stay on this slide, please. Yeah, sorry. I thought I had another picture of him. Now, I did not know who Alden Bradford was. I don't know. Is anybody here familiar with this individual? Because he has the most amazing career and is incredibly difficult to track. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his life. So you know, and many of you in this room probably are connected to Alden Bradford genealogically. He was originally from Duxbury. He was born here in November of 1765 to Colonel, I hope I'm going to pronounce it right, Gamaliel Bradford. Gamaliel, are we going with that one? Okay, and Sarah Alden. He had this wildly eclectic career as a minister, a teacher, a journalist, an author, a public servant. And this last category of public service apparently was something of a tradition in his family. His grandfather, the Honorable Gamaliel Bradford, had been a counselor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and also a judge in Plymouth County. And his father, Colonel Gamaliel Bradford, was a local magistrate and a ship owner who had served as a provincial soldier in the 7 Years' War and then as an officer during the American Revolution. So this family had a pretty well-established position in Duxbury, but not one member of the family, that immediate family, had ever gone to college until Alden Bradford. Everybody thought his older brother, Gamaliel, was going to be the one, but the war broke out, and Gamaliel was of an age to sign up. He enlists and is commissioned as an ensign at the age of 16 and serves throughout the duration of the war. After the war, he comes back and it just seems a little too late to sign up and go to college. So he continues with his life, and the younger Alden Bradford becomes the first member of the family to go to college, graduating from Harvard in 1786. He teaches for a while, And then he decides to go into the ministry, gets his license to preach, and then changes his mind and goes to Harvard and tutors Greek for a time until he's invited to become the minister of the Congregational Church in Wiscasset, Maine in 1793. So he heads up to Maine and serves up there for several years, tending to his flock until 1801, he is diagnosed with lung cancer and told he only has a couple of months to live. So he resigns from the church. He becomes maybe taking an easier job as a clerk of courts up there in Wiscasset. But then his political opinions get him into trouble. He is an avid Federalist, and there's a shift of political wind up in the Maine area, and he loses his position. In 1804, guess what? He's still alive and kicking. Apparently those months, nothing happened. And he's invited to come back to his home territory and give the Forefathers' Day address here in Plymouth by the Pilgrim Society. And soon after that, he's come back down here. He settles in Boston. He starts a bookselling and publishing business. It's a terrible failure. He goes into debt, loses his money, but he has one more brilliant career move ahead of him. He gets in good with the Federalists who have just swept into power again on Beacon Hill in Boston, and he is appointed the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And he serves for 12 years in a very powerful role. While serving in Boston as the Secretary of the Commonwealth, Alden becomes involved in the early organization of the Pilgrim Society, as does his brother, whose name might be familiar to you, Gershom Bradford, whose house is part of Duxbury Rural and Historical. He was eventually elected a president of the Pilgrim Society. He later shifts gears once again. He becomes the editor of the Boston Gazette. He becomes a justice of the peace and lives in New Bedford for a time. And he decides what you do towards the latter end of your life. I'm going to write. So then he publishes a number of historical works, including a multi-volume history of Massachusetts. According to one newspaper account, in these later years of his life, his activity was indefatigable. There was no more danger of his mind being permitted to rust on the eve of 80 than in the bloom of life. Now, interestingly, the historian Samuel Eliot Morison was tasked with composing a memoir of Alden Bradford's wide-ranging life for the Massachusetts Historical Society after he had passed. And he was profoundly unimpressed with Bradford's historical work. He found no permanent value in them. And in Morison's words, although a careful, honest, and on the whole accurate historian, his conception of history is narrow. His style is dry and lifeless, and his treatment of events partisan. Fortunately, these comments were published after Alden Bradford's death at the age of, I think it was 78, on the cusp of 80, in 1843 up in Boston. And whether he was dry and lifeless on the page, his deeply rooted interest in the history of his homeland here, the place where he came from, really helped to give life to the Pilgrim Society. And his name is inscribed on this great parchment roll of the early members of the society that we have in our archive. So it's good to know there was a dash or two of Aldens, and there are likely many more who are involved in the early society. Now let's go to the next slide. And these are the articles of incorporation that this group of people set out for themselves, a very ambitious scope. They wanted to procure in Plymouth a plat of ground for the erection of a monument to perpetuate the memory of the virtues, the enterprise, and the unparalleled sufferings of their ancestors who first settled in that ancient town, and for the erection of a suitable building for the accommodation of the meeting of the said associates, which monument and building shall forever be free from taxation. A good move on their part. And they were well ahead of the curve of thinking of nonprofit organizations. Next slide, please. Now, at the end of the organization's very first year, statesman and orator Daniel Webster accepted an invitation to deliver a public address before the society on the 22nd of December to commemorate the completion of the 2nd century since the first permanent settlement of New England in December of 1620. So this was Plymouth's bicentennial. And it was quite a coup to have someone of Webster's stature. He spoke for 2 hours. The event was held in Plymouth's first church, and then they followed with a grand dinner in the newly completed courthouse. And what Webster did was amplify the Pilgrims and Plymouth's historical significance for a new generation of Americans, while also speaking very powerfully against the slave trade and casting New England as kind of a model for freedom and morality for the rest of the nation. But Webster also conveyed a sense of history in more immediate and personal terms that I think spoke directly to the audience that he was addressing in Plymouth, here in the Old Colony. And these are his words. "There is a local feeling connected with this occasion too strong to be resisted, a sort of genius of the place, which inspires and awes us. We feel we are on the spot where the first scene of our history was laid." And I think this is beautifully expressed, and I think it's something that everyone in this room can understand when you come to your ancestral ground and you feel that sense of place. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I like that idea. Thank you, Pauline. She said that quote should be in the museum. There's a lot of things that get pulled out of Daniel Webster's 2-hour speech, but this little nugget, I think, speaks to us all. And it was very widely published, and this speech accomplished all that the Pilgrim Society had desired and hoped for, drawing national attention to the story of the Pilgrims. Next slide, please. Yeah. Got it? Okay, there we go. So they wasted no time in really developing plans for the building to be equipped with these public assembly rooms and a room for antiquities. The Society's records show us that the museum was intended to be not a private club or organization like many other so-called early museums in America, but it always had a public component as its intent. They wanted to have these meeting rooms. They wanted to have things on display. By the spring of 1822, they'd raised enough money to purchase a lot on Court Street, and they had a balance of about $4,000 to begin building the hall. And remarkably, 4 years later, they achieved it. It's also clear from the very beginning that their plans included the display of a very particular painting, this monumental canvas that is in our collection, Henry Sargent's Landing of the Pilgrims, which he painted about 1818 as this little group was first getting together. It fits exactly between the 2 sidelight windows in the main hall, just barely fits. Next slide, please. Our hall was designed by Alexander Paris. He was an architect of note with roots in the South Shore in nearby Halifax and Pembroke, who was really making a name for himself with his designs in the Greek Revival style. And he was commissioned to create the plan for Pilgrim Hall Museum and proposed a stone temple with a columned granite entrance in the plain Doric order. It wasn't very elaborate, but the cost was quite staggering to this group. And they scaled it back a little, as sometimes happens in these projects, in an interesting way. And they hired a couple of local contractors, Abner and Jacob Taylor, to build the hall for the more modest amount of money of $5,000. Next slide, please. On September 1, the cornerstone was laid. There are some conflicting records that it was actually August 31st. But it was laid with appropriate solemnities, and they placed memorabilia in a time capsule, including early newspapers, a sermon. I hope it was a copy of Robert Cushman. I can't imagine they put anything original in there. Coins, a marker naming the architects and builders, and pardon me. But the Society was still wary of overextending itself financially, and they opted not to fully complete Paris's plan for the building. And not to build the portico that the architect had designed. The intention was, as soon as their funding got a little bit better, they would complete that. And I think, let's move to the next slide. Let's see what we can see here. Okay. It would take almost a decade for the museum to be more fully finished, but it's still pretty astonishing that what happened between September 1, when they laid that cornerstone and put the time capsule in, and when they opened the building, December 17th, 1824. That's less than 4 months after the cornerstone was laid, and they're hosting their first meeting in the hall of a new building. And a few days later, Pilgrim Hall opens to the public, December 22nd, 1824, and it's been open continuously ever since, including with the landing of the Pilgrims by Henry Sargent. The artist actually donated it to the museum a few years later in 1835. Next slide, please. Everybody who attended the event had their names added to the great parchment roll of the Pilgrim Society, and you can find many Duxbury names and people that Alden names on this document as well. Next slide. Now, one of the great purposes of the society was to be this repository of important things. And really, this is one of the major claims to fame for Pilgrim Hall Museum, is the quality and richness of its early collections. And they began as early as July of 1820. So organization organized in January, and by July, they're beginning to collect stuff. And one of the first things, the first thing that is accepted is a pewter platter associated with Miles Standish as part of the collection. And in May of 1822, a couple of years later, they form a committee to collect and preserve these literary relics. Next slide. But earlier than that, even earlier, they had actually appointed a curator for the museum. On May 29th, 1820, just a couple of months after the society was founded, Revolutionary War veteran Dr. James Thatcher is chosen as the first librarian and cabinet keeper, that's what they called a curator in those days, of Pilgrim Hall. And he's another one of this Revolutionary War generation with an incredible story, a really significant figure. He was born down in Barnstable in 1754, and he came of age, like Alden Bradford's brother, during these critical years of the American Revolution. When he was 21 years old in 1775, he enlists in the Continental Army as a surgeon's mate. He's done his training with a doctor down on the Cape and is planning on going into the medical field. And he serves throughout the war as an army surgeon, witnessing many of the key events of the American Revolution. He was at the Battle of Dorchester Heights. He went on the expedition to Fort Ty. He served at the Army Hospital in Albany. He personally witnessed the execution of Major Andre, the British spy. He actually tended himself to Benedict Arnold, who was wounded with a musket ball at the Battle of Crown Point, New York. And eventually he's attached to General George Washington's command and is present at the decisive Battle of Yorktown and the British surrender. And he serves to January 1782 through the end of the war. And afterwards, he decides to retire, not going back down to the Cape, but he comes to Plymouth to live. And he opens up a very lucrative medical practice for himself, and he also begins to write. He writes a history, a memoir of his experience as a military surgeon in the war. It's still a very important source for scholars of the Revolution today. And with the 250th coming up next year, there's a lot of local references. So I urge you all to go and find online James Thatcher's Military Journal of the American Revolution and take a look at it. You're going to find some really interesting things about your communities here. So Thatcher had very wide-ranging interests, especially in the areas of science and medicine. He published on a variety of subjects, including hydrophobia. He was interested in orchards and botany, and published The American Orchardist, a treatise on the management of bees, and even an essay on demonology, ghosts, apparitions, and popular superstitions in 1831. But he really was a cornerstone of local history here. And in 1832, he published the first printed history of the town of Plymouth, which he presented as a minute narrative of the settlement of the oldest town in the New England territories. He provides us in that publication with the first written account of the story of Plymouth Rock, which he based on oral traditions that he had encountered and documented during his time in Plymouth. He was a highly influential person. He brought considerable depth and consequence to this brand new museum, Pilgrim Hall, and he helped to anchor it as a significant American institution. So these were some of our cast of characters behind the early society. And like you, you're all part of an organization, a society. How you get involved, the people you bring around the table really are meaningful to what you can get done. We have some wonderful evidence of that with the Alden Kindred these days. Next slide. Now, I don't know if you're gonna be able to see this all this well. I don't know how the light is, but if you click play, you should be able to see a little show of sort of why Pilgrim Hall, nope, right there. There should be a little button down below. You see it? Let me come and look. Maybe it didn't translate, and that's fine. Here we go. Here's John Alden's signature. So this is the collection. It's just going to run through some images of, just these stellar. I mean, I've been at the museum now since 2016, 8 years, and the quality. It's trying to see if, yeah, it's running. Of these artifacts, their antiquity, their rarity. Each one is just, this incredibly absorbing artifact, like the cradle of Peregrine White, how it was carefully made of willow osier. Each thing has such a rich story to it. So that's something that Pilgrim Hall Museum is quite famous for. And a lot of these, of course, come from Mayflower families. They have some of them better than others, but they have provenance and connections, as we heard from our friend of the New Plymouth Gard. They're thinking about how do we know who owns what, especially when it's dug out of the ground. But some of these things have associations that bring them, make them seem much more likely that they may have been things that actually came on the Mayflower. All right, I don't know if this is, yes, you can go to the next slide, please. Yep, so just going back, the creation of Pilgrim Hall was a process. There was an evolution. It's had several episodes of, just like you've had with your facilities here, right? You build it one way and you realize you need to do more. In December of 1833, a committee of the organization worked on securing an architect who would finish Pilgrim Hall. They had left off the frontage of the building. It didn't have the columns that had been envisioned. It just actually had a bare brick face, and I can't quite imagine this lovely little temple just with a flat brick front. And they even, the steps that project so far out that actually adds 20 feet to the front of the building. They didn't build those either. So like, how do people even get in the building? They didn't have the steps. So anyway, at this time they commissioned, a few years later, they had to raise $10,000. Well, they had to raise a significant amount of money. They balked at raising $10,000 to do it in granite, and they decided they'd cheap out once again, and they do it in wood. So they hired Russell Warren, an architect of Providence, Rhode Island, to design a wooden version. And so there are these 6 fluted columns that go in the building in 1834, and they are painted so that with a textured paint so that they look like stone. And those stay in place until 1920, when finally Pilgrim Hall Museum's full vision is realized, and the beautiful granite that we have there today was installed during Plymouth's 300th anniversary celebration, the tercentenary event, an event that the museum and the society were very deeply involved in planning and implementing. Next slide, please. So the society always had a rather ambitious scope. It was more than just building the hall. It was more than just observing Forefathers' Day. They wished to really create memorial ground on the spot in Plymouth. One of the things that had always concerned the early members was the preservation of Plymouth Rock. It had a very peripatetic history. It had been dragged up, part of it, in the town square during the American Revolution. Eventually, on Independence Day in 1834, that little top part ended up coming down the street and was plunked right down in front of Pilgrim Hall Museum. You can see on the next slide. There it is, in a beautiful fence that was created for it. And it certainly drew a lot of visitors to Pilgrim Hall Museum. And so if you read in accounts of people coming and visiting Plymouth Rock before 1880, they are visiting the front of Pilgrim Hall Museum, where the rock was on display. And I really kind of love the idea. I kind of wish maybe they didn't give it up because you'd be right up close to it and you'd see it. And the wrought iron fence was just a beautiful piece of artisanship. It was embellished with swags. It had the names of all the signers of the Mayflower Compact. It had scallop shells, the symbol of pilgrimage. And it also helped protect the rock from souvenir hunters. So you can find references to Pilgrim Hall Museum in many, many outside sources, but Henry David Thoreau's journal is an interesting one because he visits Pilgrim Hall in 1851, and he records in his journal They used to crack off pieces of the forefathers' rock for visitors with a cold chisel until the town forbade it. Now, I don't know if he means before it came and was put in the fence, or if actually at Pilgrim Hall, they were allowing people to go out with a curator and take off a chunk of the rock. Next slide, please. But the society considered the rock to be more than a lawn attraction, and it deserved a more appropriate setting. So at mid-century, the maturing organization embarks really in earnest on the monument building that had been part of its original scope and vision. They developed plans for a granite canopy to be placed over the portion of the Plimmoth rock that was still embedded down on the waterfront, and also to create a new memorial, this massive national monument to the forefathers. In 1855, they commissioned architect and illustrator Hammett Billings for both of these projects because he offered to raise the funds himself. Wow, can't say no to that. If his designs were accepted, they did accept his designs, to give him some assistance through the years with the fundraising. The society had its own work to do because they needed to purchase the land to put these memorials. So over the years, they're raising money, they're buying parcels of land, they have a plan and vision for what Plymouth's memorial areas are going to look like. And to achieve that, they need to piecemeal and patchwork all these different elements together. And at the same time, they're now, building a museum, taking care of the museum, developing this collection. But August 2nd, 1859, the cornerstone for both the canopy, first canopy over Plimmoth Rock, and the National Monument for the forefathers is laid. There were 6,000 people who came out for this ceremony. They came down in the train from Boston. They came from everywhere. It was a huge, huge event. But then the Civil War, and then there was some financial hardship. So it took a long time for the vision to come together. Finally, the Billings canopy over the rock was completed in November of 1867. And they took the bones that had been found on multiple occasions over the years of Mayflower pilgrims that had been discovered on Coles Hill, and they placed them in the upper part of that canopy. So when you look at that little arched canopy, there's a little lead-lined area in there with the actual human remains of some of those who died the first winter in Plymouth. They are now in the sarcophagus on top of Coles Hill. When that was taken down, the bones were transferred. In our archives, we actually have a photograph of the bones when they were taken out of this and transferred to the other. In 1880, after 46 years on the museum lawn and 106 years after it was removed from its original site on the waterfront, the society reunited both pieces of Plimmoth Rock, bringing the upper half and the lower half together under the canopy that they had provided. Next slide. A few years later, the society ticked off another accomplishment. The National Monument to the Forefathers was completed. And on August 1st, 1889, they dedicate the largest solid granite monument in America. It took many, many decades to complete that. The 81 high finished monument was half the size of what they originally planned. Can you imagine that thing? Twice the size. And I don't think I've given you the picture of it, but in the early plans, you can see that the base was the size of the present monument, and you would walk in there, and they were planning on having a library in there, and also a way that you would be able to go inside and go up into the body of the statue of faith in the center. So fantastic. I mean, it'd be like, huge, huge, but they did scale it down, and it's still hugely impressive. In 1974, the society had Forefathers Monument added to the National Register of Historic Places, and in 2001, the society deeded the monument to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They wanted to give it to them for the people of Massachusetts, but for technical reasons, for the deed, they had to sell it for $1. So after years and decades of fundraising and building this and creating it, they turned it over to the Commonwealth. And I just must say, one of my pet peeves is that you hear people talking about the Forefathers Monument, and many, many people forgot that the Pilgrim Society and Pilgrim Hall Museum created that. Next slide, please. The impact of our organization is really evident for anyone that has visited modern day Plymouth. And one of the key aspects was preserving Coles Hill. Again, this group of people, they had that sense of place. They knew these sites were important to them and they wanted to preserve them. So they begin purchasing private lots on Coles Hill in the 1850s and 60s. They're acquiring properties, they're tearing them down, they're clearing the land. And so when we go to Coles Hill today and we see it's a hill, we can see a geographic feature. That's because the society purchased those lots and patched that space back together again. In 1993, the society granted ownership of Coles Hill to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for $1 for the public to enjoy as part of Pilgrim Memorial State Park. So if you've ever enjoyed the 4th of July fireworks or the America's Hometown Thanksgiving Parade from the lovely vantage of Coles Hill, it's due to the diligence and effort of those early members that we've been talking about. Next slide. And you can just hit that. And as I'm talking, we'll let it run. So we're talking 200 years of history. There's just so much we can say about the architecture of the building, and people get into like, what was they doing? What was this carving of figures, the landing of the pilgrims on the front in the pediment, and you know, what happened to that and where did it go? So there's stories about every aspect of this old building that we enjoy as our headquarters today. The addition of a library wing in 1904 that we still use, its modern expansion in 2008, and then there's the pending restoration that we're beginning this fall. And I guess I can't see where we're at yet, but is it still running? It'll take us right through to the common. There we are, I think, within living memory now. Remember the ladies in 1975 was the first national exhibition of women's history in America, and it happened in Plymouth at Pilgrim Hall Museum. Really amazing. Betty Ford, who was the first lady at the time, came and opened the exhibition. All right, and here we are enjoying our 200th year. We just got two more slides, I think. Next slide, please. Okay, we are the oldest public museum in America. There are earlier organizations, but we were founded with a public purpose, not to be a private organization, but a public purpose and to be a repository, to have artifacts, to have artworks. So I think that claim holds. There are 1 or 2 organizations, but we are the only ones still operating in our original building. So that's part of why we give ourselves that claim. Next slide, please. And we're, as you know, doing massive work. We are about to starting in about a week's time to replace the roof and skylight of the 1824 building, and all of the artwork in that wonderful hall, these massive monumental paintings, are being taken off the wall and very carefully rolled up, and they're going to go to the conservation lab, and after construction they'll come back in, and we're going to turn the hall into a place where you will be able to see the on-site conservation of some of these artworks, just as you might have seen a few years ago when we did the Sargent painting. Next slide. So you can kind of see where I'm coming from. Today is just our hall is not what you might remember from the last time you go. We are still open during the process. We have fabulous things on exhibition in our special gallery and in our lower gallery. But come another week or so, that main hall is going to be cleared of all its artworks. Next slide, please. For the first time since 1824, there's going to be only one thing in the room, and that's the Sargent painting. It's going to look like it was the day it first opened. And we're going to have a huge party there. September 1, 6 to 9 p.m. It's going to be a costume ball, but you don't have to wear a costume. You can come just as you like. There's going to be 17th century dancing, and you don't have to dance if you don't want to, but it really is fun if you want to try, and it's all taught. And we're just going to have a blast. And I encourage any of you that live in the area that would like to come and celebrate with us, please, please do. And thank you so much. It's a privilege and honor to be part of the Alden Kindred.
Donna, and also we'll check our online friends.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes, right. Yes, Mark.
What happened to that wood pediment with the landing?
Oh, here's the question. The wood pediment. Did you see it in the pictures? I can't tell if anyone can see anything. So there's this wonderful sculpture that was put in the 1880s, and it really is life size. Some of those figures are as tall as a real person, of the shallop and some of the figures coming, but it also had kind of a offensive sculpture of a native person kind of bowing down and welcoming the group. And even in the 1880s, believe it or not, people commented on that and didn't think it was appropriate because it didn't reflect how things actually happened. As soon as it went up, people were kind of, I don't know about this. And they ended up, taking it down. I don't even think it was up 10 years. And it gets scattered. Apparently it was in the attic of the museum for some time and then it vanishes. And only the head of Tisquantum or Squanto was ever seen again. It turned up in an antique store somewhere in the mid-Atlantic and somebody, I think it might have been New York, somebody purchased it, brought it back to the museum, and we have that piece in the museum. And it really was, it would have been a beautiful sculpture to just see it. I mean, it's all handcrafted out of solid wood. So, but that's what happened to it. That's where it came from. So go into the antique stores. I know it's terribly hot. If anyone has questions, please feel free to come up and thank you so much.